When I was 14 years old, my family and I went on a camping trip to a state park. My friend and I were excited to spend our days exploring the woods and our nights telling scary stories around the campfire. But little did we know, our adventure would take a dark and terrifying turn. As we set up our tents, my friend and I decided to take a walk through the woods, a ritual we called the walk. We loved navigating through the dense forest, using our flashlights to guide us through the darkness. But on this particular night, we decided to venture further into the woods than we ever had before. As we walked, the trees seemed to grow taller and the shadows deeper. We heard strange noises, like twigs snapping and leaves rustling, but we brushed it off as mere wildlife. But then, we heard the whispering, soft and low. It seemed to come from all around us. We spun around, shining our flashlights in every direction, but there was no one there. We tried to shake off the feeling of unease and continued our walk, but the whispering grew louder, more urgent. We stopped and listened, our hearts racing, and then we saw her, a woman crawling on the ground, her dark clothes blending into the shadows. She was whispering random words, her voice barely audible. We froze, our flashlights fixed on her. She looked up, her eyes locking onto ours, and stood up. "I'm looking for my campsite," she declared, her voice slurred. We exchanged a nervous glance and decided to help her. As we walked her back to the campground, she stumbled and staggered, her words slurring together. We finally found her campsite, but her friends were nowhere to be found. They had left her behind, unaware she was missing. We helped her into her tent, feeling relief and unease. As we walked back to our campsite, we couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. The next day we saw her again, sitting by the campfire, her eyes sunken and her skin pale. She barely acknowledged us, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. We tried to avoid her, but she kept appearing, always lurking in the shadows. One night, we decided to take the walk again, hoping to shake off the feeling of unease. But as we walked deeper into the woods, we heard the whispering again. This time it was louder, more urgent. We spun around, shining our flashlights in every direction, but there was no one there. And then we saw her, standing before us, her eyes black as coal, her skin gray as the trees. She was whispering, her voice growing louder, more menacing. We tried to run, but our feet felt heavy, as if rooted. She started to move towards us, her eyes fixed on ours, her whispering growing louder. We were paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was back at our campsite, my friend shaking me awake. "What happened?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You just collapsed," he replied, his eyes filled with concern. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice firm. "We have to leave now." We packed our tents and left the campsite, never looking back. We never spoke of that night again, but the memory of the whispering woman stayed with me, haunting my dreams and making me wonder, what happened in those woods? When I first met Daniel, he seemed like a normal guy. We both needed a roommate to split the rent, and he was polite, clean, and easy to talk to. We moved into a small apartment together, and everything seemed fine. At first, living with Daniel was great. He cooked dinner sometimes, and was always ready to help with chores. We would watch movies together and talk about our days. He worked at a small bookstore downtown, and I had a job at a local coffee shop. Our lives were simple and calm. But then, things started to change. Daniel became more secretive. He would stay out late and sometimes come home with a strange look in his eyes. I would ask him where he had been, and he would shrug and say he had been out with friends. But something felt off. There were nights when I heard him talking on the phone in a calm voice, saying things that didn't make sense. Once, I heard him say they can't find out. It's too risky. One night I came home late from work. The apartment was dark except for a small light coming from Daniel's room. I heard a strange noise, like someone crying. I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. The crying stopped suddenly. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Daniel, are you okay?" I called out. There was a long silence before he replied, "Yeah, just tired. Going to bed now." The next morning, Daniel seemed like his usual self again, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. I started noticing other things. There were times when Daniel's clothes had small stains, and he quickly hid them. I found a small knife in the bathroom cabinet with dried blood on it. When I confronted him, he laughed it off, saying he cut himself while cooking. Days turned into weeks, and the feeling of dread grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started avoiding Daniel and spending more time at work or out with friends. But even then, I couldn't escape the fear that gripped me whenever I was home. One evening, I decided to do some investigating of my own. Daniel had gone out, and I knew he wouldn't be back for a few hours. I went into his room and started looking around. I felt guilty invading his privacy, but I needed to know what was going on. I opened his closet and found a box hidden under some clothes. My heart pounded as I opened it. Inside the box were newspaper clippings about several unsolved murders in our city. Each article was marked with notes in Daniel's handwriting. There were photos of the victims, details about the crime scenes, and even some small personal items that belonged to them. I felt sick to my stomach. My hands shook as I put everything back and closed the box. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my phone and left the apartment, not knowing where to go. I ended up at a nearby park, sitting on a bench trying to calm down. I called the police and told them everything I had found. When the police arrived, I showed them the box. They took it seriously and started asking me questions about Daniel. I told them about his strange behavior, the late nights, and the bloodstains. They assured me they would look into it. The next few days were a blur. I stayed with a friend, too scared to go back to the apartment. The police kept in touch, telling me they were watching Daniel. They needed more evidence before they could make an arrest. Finally, one night, I got a call from the police. They had arrested Daniel. He had been caught trying to dispose of another victim's belongings. The police had linked him to several murders through the evidence they found in our apartment. I felt a mix of relief and horror. The person I had been living with, the person I had shared my life with, was a murderer. I went back to the apartment to pack my things. It felt different, darker. Every corner seemed to hold a secret, every shadow a hidden danger. I couldn't believe I had lived with a killer and hadn't known. As I packed, I found a note in my room. It was from Daniel. "I'm sorry you found out this way. I never wanted to hurt you. You were the only real friend I had. Goodbye." I left the apartment that night, never to return. I moved to a different city, trying to start fresh, but the memories haunted me. Every night, I wondered how I had missed the signs. I wondered how many lives could have been saved if I had noticed sooner. Living with Daniel changed me forever. I became more cautious and more aware of the people around me. I never let anyone get too close. The fear and mistrust stayed with me, a reminder of the dark secret I had lived with, the secret of my roommate, the murderer. I was driving down an empty highway one night, the road stretching out in front of me like a dark ribbon. The only light came from my car's headlights and the pale sliver of the moon hanging in the sky. It was late and I was tired. The radio had lost its signal miles back, leaving me alone with the hum of the engine and my thoughts. As I drove, I noticed the gas gauge was dangerously low. I should have filled up at the last town, but I thought I could make it to the next one. Now I wasn't so sure. The needle was hovering just above empty, and there wasn't a gas station in sight. Suddenly, the car started to sputter. I pressed down on the gas pedal, but it didn't help. The engine made a choking noise, and then, with a final cough, it died. I coasted to a stop on the side of the road, my heart sinking. No, 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 I muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine cranked, but refused to start. I tried again, but it was no use. I was out of gas in the middle of nowhere. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I was completely cut off. The road was empty, and there were no houses or businesses around. Just trees and darkness. I decided to lock the car and wait inside. Maybe someone would come by, or maybe the signal would return if I waited long enough. I didn't want to leave the car and wander around in the dark. It felt safer inside, with the doors locked. Time passed slowly. I checked my phone every few minutes, but there was still no signal. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I tried to stay calm, but my nerves were starting to fray. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned my head and saw a figure emerging from the woods. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure came closer. It was a man, tall and thin, with wild hair and a scruffy beard. He looked like he'd been living in the woods for a while. He walked up to my car and stopped by the driver's side window. He peered in at me, his eyes wide and wild. Then he started knocking on the window, slowly at first, then harder. The sound echoed in the still night air.
"Hey, let me in,"
he said, his voice muffled through the glass. "I need help." I shook my head, my hands gripping the steering wheel. There was no way I was letting this stranger into my car. "Please," he said, knocking harder. "Let me in." I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with possibilities. What did he want? Why was he out here in the middle of the night? I felt a chill run down my spine. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I saw headlights approaching from behind. A car was coming. Relief washed over me. I honked the horn, hoping to get the driver's attention. The approaching car slowed down and came to a stop behind me. It was a police car. 2 officers got out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They walked up to my car, and the man from the woods stepped back, his eyes darting nervously. "Is everything all right here?" one of the officers asked, shining his flashlight into my car. I quickly unlocked the door and got out. "My car ran out of gas," I said, my voice shaky. This man came out of the woods and started knocking on my window. "I don't know what he wants." The officers turned to the man, who was standing a few feet away, looking anxious. "Sir, what are you doing out here?" one of the officers asked. The man didn't answer. He just turned and started walking back into the woods. The officers watched him go, then turned back to me. "You're lucky we came by," the second officer said. "It's not safe to be out here alone at night. We'll call a tow truck for you and give you a ride to the nearest town." I nodded, grateful and relieved. As I got into the back of the police car, I glanced back at the woods. The man had disappeared into the darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. That night on the dark highway was something I would never forget. It reminded me how quickly things can go wrong and how important it is to be prepared. And it left me with a lingering sense of unease, wondering what might have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks.